G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Joshua. This has been taken from a commentary by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're now into the third session of the book of Joshua. Just a little bit of a recap on last session. Last session, we see Joshua sent out 2 spies to check out the land of Canaan, and especially the city of Jericho. And they went to a house of a harlot by the name of Rahab, and they remained there to get information because she knows what's going on in the city. And the king found out about these 2 spies, and he came looking for them. However, they were hidden by Rahab, and she lied to the king of their whereabouts. Now, regarding her lying to the king, needs to be looked at. Rahab put herself at personal risk hiding the spies, and to show her what she's doing is actually showing her identification with Israel. And sometimes sometimes it's necessary to show loyalty to the God of Israel in showing the love of neighbor. Now, her lie need not be classed as a sin, but as an act to protect the people of God. Because if she had revealed to the king's servants their whereabouts, it would have caused their deaths, and that certainly would have indeed been a sin. Now, Rahab, we find that has already believed in the God of Israel. Why? Because of what they had heard about God's dealings with Israel over the previous 40 years. Remember, they spoke about the first and the crossing of the Red Sea and then the crossing of the Jordan. So they heard, crossing of the Red Sea, they heard about that, and they heard about the exploits with the 2 kings. So they knew about Israel over the last 40 years. And so they were very fearful of Israel. And she knew also that God would give Israel the land. And she even knew the covenant name of God, the God of Israel, which was Jehovah. So Rahab makes an agreement with the spies to protect her and her family when they take the city of Jericho. And this is on the proviso that she says nothing about them. Now, the conditions for their safety was that she should tie a scarlet cord in her window to identify her house and to have all her family inside with her. That was the deal that she made with the 2 spies. Now, Rahab, we know, will become part of the Commonwealth of Israel, and she'll actually marry into the tribe of Judah, and she'll become an ancestress of the Messiah. Now, moving on to today's session, we're looking at the crossing of the Jordan River from chapter 3, verse 1 to chapter 5, verse 1. A bit of a chronological sequence here, 3:1 to 4:18. Before we begin, let's have a look at, if I can present the sequence of the crossing here so we can understand the chronology a bit better. We put it in the following order. First of all, on the day before the crossing, the people were given instructions as to their spiritual preparations. We saw that back, we'll see that in chapter 3, verse 5. They're also going to be told to march, but to keep a distance of 2,000 cubits. I think it's about 900 meters, 950 meters away from the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to see that in chapter 3, verses 3 to 4. Also, on the morning of the crossing itself, so this is all the first day, and though the crossing itself, they received instructions on the crossing itself, instructing the leaders on the orders of the day. See that in verse 8 to 13 when we get there. And then the march toward the Jordan River we see in verse 14. And then the priests are going to carry the ark, and they'll arrive at the edge of the river at a place called Adam. And then we're going to see the river will stop flowing, and the bottom of the river became dry, at which point Joshua and the 12 leaders and Israel crossed over the river very quickly. That's verses 16 to 17. And then we have the 12 leaders. We're going to see that they're going to pick up a heavy stone from the riverbed where the priests were standing, and they're going to setting up in Gilgal later on. That's chapter 4 we're going to get to. Now, the 7th thing we see is that Joshua will set up a memorial of the 12 stones in the riverbed, another one, where the priests were then standing. We're going to see that in 4, verse 9. And then 8th, at Joshua's command, the priest bearing the ark left the spot where they were standing and crossed over to the west side of the riverbank. And at that point, we're going to see the waters will return back to normal in chapter 4, verse 18. So that's the basic chronology of the sequence we're going to see. Now, let's go through the passage itself. The crossing of the Jordan River, chapter 3:1 to 5:1. Here we see the crossing in verses 1 to 17 of chapter 3, and we see the preparation for the crossing in verses 1 to 6. In 3:1, we have the journey from Shittim to the Jordan River, and the timing is, it says, and Joshua rose up early in the morning. And then we see the journey. It says they removed from Shittim and came to the Jordan, and it was he and all the children of Israel, and they lodged there before they passed over. So this will be at Shittim down to the banks of the Jordan here. Now, early in the morning, we see Joshua and the Israelites began their journey from Shittim, where they had camped, toward the Jordan River. And in verses 2 to 5, we have the instruction to the officers for the crossing. The timing is in verse 2. It says, and it came to pass after 3 days, the officers now went through the midst of the camp. And so these were the Shokrim, which we looked at earlier in chapter 1. So after leaving the encampment in this place called Shittim, these officers passed through the camp of the Israelites in order to provide some instructions to the people. In verses 3 to 4, we have the instructions. It says, they commanded the people, saying, now in verse 3, they spell out the signal to move. And the signal is, when you see the ark of the covenant of Jehovah your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it. And then it says, then you shall remove from your place and go after the ark. So in verse 4, we have the specific instructions. It says, you need to keep a distance. The distance here, it says, yet there shall be a space between you and it, but between the people and the ark, of 2,000 cubits by measure. So this is, if you're in feet, 3,000 feet. If you're in meters, 915 meters. And so they were to keep a distance of about 915 meters from the ark, and then, or 3,000 feet. And this would then show the sacredness of the ark and show reverence for it. Can't get too close to it. And also, this would allow for the greatest number of people to actually observe the ark when crossing the River Jordan. Now, according to the rabbis, this became the basis for the Sabbath day's journey, which is 2,000 cubits. And so they developed the Sabbath day's journey from this passage here. Now we have a prohibition here. It says, come not near unto it. And the reason is that you may know the way by which you must go. So we see that the purpose of the ark was not only to show them the way, but also to make a way for them to cross the river. It says, for you have not passed this way heretofore. So they had never been here before. This is the first time. So the ark was for a dual purpose. It was to show the route they should take, but it was also going to make a way for them to get through the river. And in verses 5 to 6, we have the instructions from Joshua. In verse 5, the instructions are, first of all, to the people. And Joshua said unto the people, now the command is to sanctify yourselves. This is to consecrate themselves in preparation for what is going to be a miracle. And this was common procedure with Israel in preparation for a new miracle or a new revelation, as was the case back in Exodus 19, verses 10 to 15. And the reason we see in the second part of verse 5 is Joshua says, for tomorrow Jehovah will do wonders before you. And now moving into verse 6, we have the instructions to the priests. That's the instructions to the people, now to the priests. Joshua now spoke unto the priests, saying, take up the ark of the covenant, pass over before the people. And then in verse 6b, the second part of verse 6, we have their obedience. And it says, and they took up the ark of the covenant, and they went before the people. So we're on the move. In verses 7 to 8, we now have the divine encouragement. Now, after Joshua finished giving his instructions to both the people and the priests, God now speaks to Joshua. In verse 7, it says, and Jehovah said unto Joshua. Now, this distinguishes now between what God would do and what Joshua is to do. Right? This is what we see here. So he starts out with what God is going to do in verse 7. And the promise here is this, This day will I begin to magnify you, that's Joshua, in the sight of all Israel. So God promised that he would begin to exalt Joshua in the eyes of all of Israel. Now, the purpose of this is that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So the purpose of making it known that he was with him just as he had been with Moses. This is why he's doing this. And the miracle would now authenticate Joshua in a very similar way that God had authenticated Moses. And what this way, as I was with Moses, which we saw back in verse 7, as I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. And we're going to see this a little bit later on explained in verse 13. Now, the act in verse 7, as I said, will be explained in verse 13. Now, in verse 8, God spells out what Joshua is to do. And you shall command the priests that bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when you are come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. So here the verse contains a reference to a specific time. The moment Israel's priests came to the Jordan, they had to follow God's command of standing in the river. Now that's going to be a huge test of faith. And we see the instructions for the crossing in verses 9 to 13. God's promises to Joshua are followed by specific instructions for the crossing of the river. In verse 9 we have the call. And Joshua said unto the children of Israel, come hither and hear the words of Jehovah your God. So Joshua now informed the people that what he was about to say was extremely important. And in verses 10 to 13, we have the message. And Joshua said, now here we see in verse 10, he focuses on the vindication. Hereby you shall know, and they shall know two things. First up, that the living God is among you. That's the first thing they're going to know. And second, that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanite, the Hittite, and the Hivite, and the Perizzite, and the Girgashite, and the Amorite, and the Jebusite. So, what he's saying here is that the Israelites would know with certainty that God was among them during the conquest and that he would drive out the Canaanite nations before them. And then in verse 11, Joshua then explained how they would know this. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth passes over before you into the Jordan. So the fact that the ark of the covenant would go into the river ahead of them was to assure the people that God was among them. And in verse 12, we see here is a selection of 12 men. Concerning the election, it says, now therefore take you 12 men out of the tribes of Israel. And the distribution is for every tribe a man. So we have 12 tribes, we have 12 men. Concerning this election, the Israelites were to choose 12 men from their 12 tribes. And their choice must be distributed equally, one man from each tribe. And the purpose of this selection is going to be revealed in chapter 4, verses 2 to 3. And it's going to be that these guys are going to collect stones from the river. In verse 13, he describes now the authenticating signs. And it shall come to pass, when the soles of the feet of the priests that bear the ark of Jehovah, the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, even the waters that come down from above, and they shall stand in one heap. So what he's saying to the people here is that as soon as the priests set their foot in the Jordan, the Israelites are going to see a sign, namely the parting of the waters. And now this explains verse 7. As I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. Just as remember, just as Moses parted the Red Sea with the rod, Joshua would now part the river with the ark. And the result is the authentication of God's mediator before the people. And that was, this new mediator is Joshua. And in verses 14 to 17, we have the crossing itself. we now have, in verse 14, we now have the movement towards the Jordan River. And it came to pass when the people removed from their tents to pass over the Jordan, the priests that bear the ark of the covenant being before the people. So the procession here began after the people broke camp. They were led to the river by the priests who went ahead of them carrying the ark. In verse 15, it gives us the timing of the miracle. First of all, the arrival. And when they that bear the ark were come onto the Jordan, and then the act now, so they've got to the Jordan, and now the act is, and the feet of the priests that bear the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. And then it goes on to say the circumstances. It says, for the Jordan now overflows all its banks at all the time of harvest. So it's normally, the Jordan River is between 90 and 100 feet wide and 3 to 10 feet deep. So it's 1 to 3 meters deep, and it's about, 30 meters wide, something like that, 30 meters wide. But this was the barley harvest time in the spring, and this was also the end of the rainy season, and the river would be at flood stage. So it's not just a gently flowing river, it's a flooding river. So all this is going to increase the miraculous. At flood stage, it is normally impossible to cross the Jordan. The only way this was possible was by swimming, and even then it was very dangerous to do so. In fact, it was so dangerous that in 1 Chronicles 12, 8 to 15, 1 Chronicles 12, 8 to 15, members of the tribe of Gad, G-A-D, the Gadites, who were known for being very brave, did this themselves. Now, the flooding here would only make the miracle even more spectacular. And in verse 16, we have the miracle itself. It's a bit of a phenomenon here. It says that the waters which came down from above, which came down from the north, because the Jordan runs from north to south down to the Dead Sea, it came down from the north, it stood and rose up in one heap a great way off. In fact, 16 miles to the north of the fords of the Jordan River at a place called Adam. And this is a city that is beside Zarethan. Now, 16 miles in our calculations would be about 25k, 28k, 28 kilometers, something like that. Okay, so this 28 kilometers between Adam and Zarethan is the only stretch in the Jordan Valley that such a damming could take place even to this day, because it's a wide stretch of riverbed drying up, which would allow for a quick crossing of 2 million people along with their livestock. And so it was a great length that allowed for the quick crossing. Historically, such events have been recorded at least twice since biblical times, but in neither case did it come during the flood stage. The first recorded event that happened was on December the 8th, 1267, when an earthquake, this is 1267 AD, when an earthquake caused the high banks of the Jordan River to collapse near Adam, which is where we're going, damming up the river for about 10 hours. More recently, the second event was July 11th, 1927. Again, an earthquake caused a similar damage for 21 hours. But again, neither of these damming happened at flood stage. They were both just normal stage. And the result we see now, and those that went down toward the Sea of the Arabah, even the Salt Sea, were wholly cut off. That's the water. River stopped running down to the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, sorry. So this is known as the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Arabah. So that what we see is that there is no water flowing south from where this was dammed up. The sea as would be normal. And we see the crossing, and the people then crossed, the people passed over right against Jericho. So verse 17 gives us the details of the crossing. First of all, it begins with the role of the priests. And the priests that bear the Ark of the Covenant of Jehovah stood firm on dry ground in the middle or in the midst of the Jordan. And the priest who had always gone ahead of the people now stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood there on dry ground. And then the role of the people, well, all Israel passed over on dry ground until all the nation were passed clean over the Jordan. And then, when the people of Israel crossed the riverbed, until the entire nation had reached the other side. So they were just standing there in the middle of the river. Now, with this crossing, the people were now committed to war because they've now crossed over the Jordan, and the Jordan's going to close behind them. So they're also now committed to walk by faith in the living God and to turn from walking according to the flesh as they had done oftentimes in the wilderness. So now they're in a situation where they have to trust in God because they're into a war zone now. A couple of observations concerning this crossing before we move on. And now the first observation is that this miracle was primarily one of timing. And we see it in several ways here. First of all, the event came to pass exactly as was predicted, as we see in verses 13 and 15. The time was exact, as we see from verse 15. It took place at flood stage, which is not true of the other recorded occasions. This is also found in verse 15. Fourth thing we see here is that the wall of water held in place for many hours, which we see in verse 16. And then also the solid riverbed became dry at once. It wasn't muddy, it wasn't soggy, it was just dried up completely. And then we see also that the waters returned to normal as soon as all the people finished crossing and the priest came up from the river. And that we see, or we're going to see in chapter 4, verse 18. And the last thing here, the other thing we see here is that the inhabitants of the land, they took it as a miracle, which we're going to see when we get to chapter 5, verse 1. Okay, second observation, we can make a comparison here of the miracle of the Red Sea and that of the miracle of the Jordan River. So here we look at some similarities and dissimilarities. Look at the dissimilarities first. We have 10 specific things. First of all, the first one, the crossing of the Red Sea, terminated the Egyptian sojourn. The second one, the Jordan River, initiated the entrance into the promised land. The second dissimilarity, the first was to escape the Egyptians. The second was to now approach and conquer the Canaanites. The third thing we see is that the first one used a strong east wind, but here no specific means was needed for this crossing of the Jordan. And fourth, the first occurred at night time, and this one occurs in broad daylight. In the first, the army of the Egyptians were killed, but no one actually died in the crossing of the second one. And the sixth, the first was for a murmuring and a disbelieving people, while the second one was for a believing and obedient people. Seventh, except for two men, those who experienced the first never possessed any of the land, while the majority of those who experienced the second, which is the crossing of the Jordan, survived the wars and they possessed the land. And then eighth, in the first, the waters were divided, while in the second, they stood up in a heap. And ninth, the people were not sanctified in advance for the first, but they were for the second. And 10, after the first, there were dead bodies everywhere. After the second, there were 12 stones. So here we have these 10 points of dissimilarities between the crossing of the Red Sea and the crossing of the river Jordan. Now we point out 12 similarities between the two. First of all, both involve water. Second, both were witnessed by the entire nation. Third, both preceded an act either by Moses or by Joshua. Fourth, both of them removed a barrier from before the people. Fifth, each one authenticated the leader chosen by God. And sixth, each presented a test of Israel's faith. And seventh, both of them passed on dry shod ground. And in eighth, both were done in silence with no shout of triumph or the blowing of the trumpet. And ninth, we see that afterwards the waters returned to normal. And in 10th, each began a new period in Israel's history. And 11th, both of them showed God's power and the consternation of the enemy. And 12th, both resulted in a song of praise The parting of the Red Sea led to Moses' song of deliverance, which we find in Exodus 15 verses 1 to 18, and we find for the River Jordan, this is Psalm 114. Okay, now we're looking at the stones of remembrance, which we see from chapter 4 verse 1 down to 24. First up, we see the purpose of the stones in verses 1 to 7. In verse 1, we have the divine revelation. And it came to pass when all the nation were clean passed over the Jordan. Now, just by the way here, it says when all the nation. The Hebrew word for nation is goy. Remember, G-O-Y. It's a term usually used for Gentiles. But here is one of the places it's actually used of Israel. Now, because of this, the rabbis explain it by saying this term is used here because it included the Gentiles who had followed Israel, such as the woodcutters and the water drawers, to signify here that the waters of the Jordan parted even for those who were affiliated with Israel. However, there's nothing in the text indicating that this term was being used of the Gentiles who were following Israel. It's used of Israel here. So when all the Israelites had finished crossing the Jordan, then came the revelation that Jehovah then spake unto Joshua, saying, now, this chapter we're about to get into actually records two separate memorials here. The first memorial was the one inside the Jordan River on the riverbed in order to show what happened. And then we have a second one, which was on the west bank of the Jordan by a place called Gilgal to show what had happened. The first, where it happened, the second, what had happened. In verses 2 to 3, we have the divine command. Verse 2, Joshua is ordered to make the selection. He says, take you 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe of man. Now, once the selection was made, Joshua was then to give an order. Verse 3, and command ye them, saying, take you hence out of the midst of the Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones, and carry them over with you and lay them down in the lodging place where you shall lodge this night. So Joshua was now to direct the 12 men he had chosen to pick up 12 stones, carry them from the riverbed to the place of their first night's encampment. Then in verse 4 to 7, we have the command to the 12 men. In verse 4, we have the call. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel, out of every tribe of man. So once he gathered these 12 guys, Joshua then gave them specific instructions in verses 5 to 7. Joshua said unto them, verse 5 is the act. He said to them, pass over before the ark of Jehovah your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. So here the instruction consisted of two parts. First of all, the 12 men were to go into the middle of the Jordan River, passing the ark. Second, they were to take up some stones, lift them on their shoulders, and carry them away. They were to represent each of the 12 tribes, 12 men, 12 tribes. And so there were to be 12 such rocks picked up from the riverbed. And then in verses 6 to 7, he spells out the purpose, that this may be a sign among you. You know, verse 6 sets up the stage of apostle question. An apostle question is that when your children ask in the time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? So these stones, this was to cause the future generations to ask, what happened here at the Jordan River when they see these stones? In verse 7 it says, you can give them the answer. Then you shall say unto them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, when it passed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. Okay, the Hebrew, the word memorial here is the Hebrew word zikaron, Z-I-C-H-A-R-O-N, and in Joshua it's only used here, but it appears 20 times in the Hebrew Bible. 13 of these times in the Mosaic books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then we have it here in Joshua as well. Now, verses 6 to 7 are written in the form of a chiasmus, We looked at this last session. I think we did look at it last session. And this is like a, and I'm trying to set it out for you so you can see it. It's A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. As you can see there on the screen, it will run like this. What it's doing is giving you a parallel account, two accounts, same thing. It's just highlighting what happened. So we look at A, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask you this in verse 6, and in the B one, what mean ye by these stones? And you shall say unto them, and the C, the waters of Jordan were cut off. D, before the ark of the covenant of Jehovah. So we're telling a story up to the point of the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, and then in the second part of the Charisma, it goes from the top back down to the bottom again. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off. These stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel. So it goes up to the top with the priest, and it comes back down to the bottom again. Okay, that's just the way Hebrew is written. Now, first stone, we now deal with the first stones in verses 8 to 13 of the Jordan. Verse 8, marking the obedience. The children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, as Jehovah spake unto Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. And they carried them over with them unto the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. So all of this shows now that the people of Israel had clearly accepted the leadership of Joshua. And in verse 9, we have the laying of the stones. We have, first of all, the setting up. And Joshua set up the 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests that bear the ark of the covenant stood. And they are there unto this day. Okay. Now, the saying unto this day appears 83 times in the Hebrew Bible. 15 of those times are found in the book of Joshua, more than any other book. The stones here were not likely intended to remain there forever, only for that generation and the one following it. Now, since the stones were heavy and placed at the edge of the riverbank, they would not have washed away any time soon, and they would have been visible when the Jordan was low during the dry season. But of course, in time, they would be washed away. Now, in verse 10, we have the crossing of the people. First of all, the role of the priest. For the priests that bear the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, that Jehovah commanded Joshua to speak unto the people according to all that Moses commanded Joshua. And then came the crossing, and the people hasted and passed over. The role of the priests was to carry the ark and to stand in the middle of the Jordan until everyone had passed them. So this crossing had to be done all in one day, and 2 million people had to cross on that day. So they hastened and crossed over. In verse 11, we're told about the crossing of the ark, and the timing came to pass when all the people were clean passed over, that the ark of Jehovah passed over, and the priests in the presence of the people. So the moment the people crossed the river, the ark of the covenant and the Kohanim, meaning the priest, came to the other side. And the verse concludes by stating that the crossing of the ark and of the Kohanim was observed by all the people. And now in verses 12 to 13, we come to the crossing of the Transjordanian tribes. These are the ones who remained on the eastern side of the Jordan. In verse 12, first of all, the tribes. It begins with a listing. It says, and the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the children of Israel, as Moses spoke unto them. So these Transjordanian tribes take the lead. In verse 13, we're told about the specific members. We see about 40,000 ready and armed for war. Now, just by the by, since only 40,000 crossed the river, it showed that the majority of the fighting men actually stayed behind on the eastern side of the Jordan. Because we know that the full figures, for example, according to Numbers 26:34, Manasseh had a total of 52,700 fighting men. In Numbers 26:7, Reuben had 43,730 fighting men, And Numbers 26:18 tells us that Gad had 40,500 men. So total male population of these three tribes of fighting men was 136,930. And so the 40,000 soldiers were only like 29% of the entire male population. Now, was this an act of disobedience? Not particularly. This would actually have to be necessary because remember, the women they'd made their life on that side of the river. So the women and the children would need to be protected and provided for. And also the land would have to be worked while the fighting was going on the west side of the Jordan. So they had to leave a protective number back on the other side. So these 40,000 passed over before Jehovah onto the battle to the plains of Jericho. Now, what's the result for Joshua in all of this? On that day, Jehovah magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. So Joshua was now clearly the divinely appointed leader, for even the priests did not enter or depart the river except at his command. So this provides a parallel with the position of Moses after the crossing the Red Sea back in Exodus 14:31. In verses 15 to 16, now we see, in verses 15 to 18, we see the crossing of the Ark of the Covenant. In verses 15 to 16, we have the command of God. In verse 15, declaring to us about the divine revelation. And Jehovah spoke unto Joshua. Now, what God said to Joshua is given in verse 16. Command the priests that bear the ark of the testimony that they come up out of the Jordan. Now, the Hebrew says Vayalu, Veyyalu, and Rashi, who is a rabbi from the Middle Ages, he uses this word Vayalu, to teach that the ark, this is the ark, lifted the priests up so that they flew over the Jordan River. Now, that's what Rashi says, all right? But that's not what the scripture says. It's not what the text tells us. But that's a rabbinic tradition. In verse 17, we have the command of Joshua. Joshua therefore commanded the priests, saying, Come ye up out of the Jordan. So now in obedience to God's instruction, Joshua told the priests to come up out of the Jordan. And in verse 18, we have the return of the waters of the Jordan. And the timing came to pass when the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of Jehovah were come up out of the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up onto the dry ground, and the waters of the Jordan returned unto their place and went over all its banks as aforetime. So the waters of the Jordan responded to the actions of the priests and resumed their natural and original flow. Now we see the second stones, Gilgal. Verse 19 describes the arrival at Gilgal, and the date is, and the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Now, exactly 40 years earlier, Israel prepared to leave Egypt, and this was the day of the setting aside of the Passover lamb. The 10th day of the first month was when the Passover lamb was to be set aside. Now, they had not practiced Passover for decades. Place now is in Gilgal, and Gilgal in Hebrew means circle, and so to this day, the exact location of Gilgal is unknown. We're told it is on the east border of Jericho, but to this day, the remains of Gilgal have not been discovered. In verse 20, we have the placing of the stones. And those 12 stones which they took up out of the Jordan did Joshua set up in Gilgal. And now the rabbis say that Gilgal was chosen because it was the first capital of Israel and remained so for the first 14 years before Israel was in the land. Now, the purpose of the stones is spelled out in verses 21 to 24. And he spoke unto the children of Israel, saying, so he begins here in 21 with the presentation of a question that may be raised by future generations. When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, what mean these stones? So when the descendants of the Israelites who had crossed the Jordan River asked what the stone symbolized, in verse 22, the answer is to be as follows. Here is the response. Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. And in verse 23, we have the exposition. With verse 23 dealing with the miracle itself. First of all, the act. For Jehovah your God dried up the waters of the Jordan from before you until you were passed over, as Jehovah your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up from before us until we passed over. So Joshua here reiterated the miracle, stating that God dried up the waters until all his people had passed across the riverbed. And he compared the events here with what God had done at the Red Sea with Moses. Verse 24, we have another purpose of the miracle. First of all, we have the purpose for the Gentiles, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of Jehovah, that it is mighty. And for the purpose for the Jews was that they would always fear him, that you may fear Jehovah your God forever. Now, the purpose of the second set of stones sorry, I gotta go to the courier at front. Pause for a sec. The purpose of the second set of stones was to teach the children in subsequent Jewish generations what God did, which was fulfilled as seen, and we see it also in later references to the miracle in the book of Psalms. Now we have two references to this miracle in the book of Psalms, Psalm 66 verse 6, Psalm 66 verse 6, and Psalm 114 verse 3. Now, second purpose is to show the nations the power of God. And third, that the Jews themselves may fear Jehovah. Response of the Canaanites we see in chapter 5 verse 1. And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites that were by the sea, heard how that Jehovah had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the children of Israel, that their hearts melted, neither was their spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel. So what we see is that the drying up of the waters of the Jordan was clearly viewed as a miracle, not just by Israel, but by the nations around them. Now, it was seen as a miracle in 7 specific ways. First of all, it fulfilled a prophesied event which we saw back in chapter 3, verse 13 to 14. Also, the timing was exact. It says when the priests dipped their feet in the water, which we saw in chapter 3:15, and also the wall of water also rose up in one heap, chapter 3:16. It happened at flood stage, which again we see in chapter 3:15. The holding of the Jordan and all of its tributaries lasted a whole day, chapter 3:16. Also, the bottom of the river became dry very quickly, sufficiently for people to walk right over it. We see that in verse 17. And seventh, the exact timing of the return of the water was when the priest came up out of the water in chapter 4, verse 18. The second observation has to do with chronology of the 7 days. On day 1, we have 5 things. First of all, instructions were given to the people to prepare to cross within 3 days. Second, we see 2 spies were sent out in chapter 2:1. Third, on that day, this is all the first day, they arrived at Rahab's house and escaped that night. The end of the hours of darkness composed the first of the 3 days of hiding, which we saw back in chapter 2, verse 22. On this day, Joshua addressed the Transjordanian tribes. We see in verse 12 to 15, chapter 1. On this day, the Transjordanian tribes affirmed their loyalty to Joshua in verses 16 to 18. Now we come to day 2. The spies continued hiding in the hills, chapter 2:22. Then came the 3rd day. Spies continued hiding, returned sometime during this day to report to Joshua in chapter 2:22 to 23. Day 4, 2 things. First of all, Joshua and the people traveled from Shittim to the Jordan River. Second, this is the first of the 3 days of Joshua 3:2. Day 5, the people remained by the Jordan River, and this is the second of those 3 days in verse 2 of chapter 3. And then day 6, this is the end of the 3 days of 3:2. And second, the officers go through the camp and instructing in the crossing. And third, Joshua issues his instructions to sanctify themselves in 3:5. Then came day 7. 2 things here. Crossing of the Jordan takes place. And second, we have the placing of the stones of remembrance in chapter 4, verse 20. Okay, now, circumcision of the people. While the nations of the land were filled with terror due to the miracle that had just occurred, God commanded Joshua to circumcise the Israelites. In verse 2, we have the divine command. At that time, Jehovah said unto Joshua, make you knives of flint and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. And the word again here means that they had once again started circumcising after 40 years of disobedience. And circumcised ones were to replace the circumcised males that perished in the wilderness. Because remember, almost 2 million died. Now, 1.2 million, I think it was. Now, since God was giving them the land based on the Abrahamic covenant, remember, Abrahamic covenant had to be circumcised, they must now be put back under the obedience of that covenant, which means circumcision. The rabbis claimed, this is the rabbis, that there was a collective circumcision before the Exodus, and this was the second collective circumcision. But again, Scripture does not confirm this. Question we need to ask, though, is this. What was the reason for failure to circumcise? What was the reason why they failed to circumcise for these 40 years? 4 possible suggestions. I've given you the best option there on the screen. Now, 4 possible suggestions are this. First of all, we don't know. The actual reason is we just don't know. A second possibility, that since they never knew exactly when they would have to travel, remember there were, the cloud and the fire, it was inconvenient to circumcise and therefore they neglected it. That was the second option. Third option is that this was willful, sinful neglect. Now, if that was the case, they were never actually condemned for failing to do that. The fourth option, which is probably the best option, the sin of Kadesh Barnea. Remember Kadesh Barnea? It caused a breach of promise. And that's found in Numbers 14, 32 to 34. What happened in Kadesh Barnea was their condemnation to a continued period of wandering for 40 years. And after, all those who came out of Egypt will die except for the 2 good spies and all those below the age of 20. Now, this apostasy that caused the judgment, this is the Kadesh Barnea one, also caused a cancellation of bringing that generation into the promised land. And because they would not go to the promised land, they were then released from the obligation of circumcision, because the promise of the land would not be fulfilled to them. So during the whole duration of the sentence of Kadesh Barnea, they were denied the token of the Abrahamic covenant. And so the crossing the Jordan showed that they were now restored to divine favor. Now, since they were to experience the covenantal experience of the land, they were now to receive the token of the covenant, since they would now enter the land of promise. Now, the rabbis came up with a very unique and ingenious explanation to avoid condemning that generation in any form. And the rabbis gave the following as a reason for the failure to circumcise. The rabbinic reason was that the atmospheric conditions necessary for healing the wound was absent for the entire 40 years. The north wind was necessary for this, but did not blow, because the cloud of glory, which, remember, the cloud of glory was leading the Israelites through the wilderness, would have been dispersed by the wind. Cloud of glory, Shekinah glory, manifest presence of God. And the fatigue and weakness incurred from constant travel made the operation dangerous. And since they were obligated to move when the cloud moved, they could not wait until the wound healed. So that's the rabbinic explanation for non-circumcision. But in verse 3 we have their obedience. And Joshua made him knives of flint and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And that's where we're going to leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.